And we intend to use our tools to keep inflation expectations anchored at 2%, which gives us the ability to do all of the things we do when the economy is weak.
It could take months, though, for the data to contradict or validate this narrative about transient inflation. And obviously, investors are twitchy right now. Do you think your guidance is too vague right now to be properly understood by investors?
I'm trying to make it as clear as possible. And I went through, the guidance. I think the guidance for the uh, for tapering asset purchases has an element of judgment in it. But I've also said that we will, well in advance of any decision to consider tapering asset purchases, will communicate about our sense of progress towards substantial further toward the goals, substantial further progress toward our goals. So we're not looking to surprise people with that. And as far as the rate liftoff guidance, it's pretty specific, and as I said, it will take some time to get there. If you think about it, it's you've got to have a very strong labor market and inflation performing in line with our. It's a picture of an economy that is all but fully recovered. And the sooner that happens, the better. But I would say realistically, that's going to take some time.
And as we sit here today, do you think the hope of a brighter outlook you've discussed here might lead to substantial further progress being met, being achieved this year?
Again, I've been so far been able to not reduce it to an estimate of time. I mean, that will come, I think, when we can see that. Right now, we haven't been making much progress. I mentioned 29,000 jobs per month for the months of November, December, and January. So, and spending was maybe a little better than that, but in the job market, you saw a real slowdown at job creation. That wouldn't get you to maximum employment anytime soon. That's just not enough. So I do expect, and many forecasters expect, that there'll be a pickup in job creation. We'll have to assess that when it comes. I don't want to be making, but again, I think realistically though, it's March, and we're going to start. Presumably in the next couple of months, we'll start to see stronger employment, and we're going to want to see substantial further progress in both maximum employment and stable prices. That's going to take some time. It just will take some time because you've had 3 months now where you didn't make much progress. So we've got to get going and start making it again. And for us to assess that and signal forward, it's going to take some time.
As you noted, the Fed is buying $120 billion per month in Treasury and mortgage securities. You've been saying for the past year, that your asset purchases are designed to support market functioning. Have you seen anything in the Treasury market that suggests a need to lengthen the maturity profile of your purchases?
So we think our current policy stance is appropriate. Uh, as I mentioned, the federal funds rate is at the effective lower bound, which is our technical name for zero or close to zero. We provided really strong guidance about the conditions we need to see before we considered raising it. We're buying $120 billion in treasuries and mortgage-backed securities across the curve, and we'll continue at least at that pace until we see substantial progress toward our goals. Financial conditions are highly accommodative, and that's appropriate given the ground that the economy has to cover. It's always the case that if conditions do change materially, the committee is prepared to use the tools that it has to foster achievement of its goals.
Well, and if there were some kind of rate move that you felt represented a threat to your outlook, what would you do to address it?
Well, that's a sort of hypothetical situation. We would use our tools. It's hard to say in the abstract, but we would use our tools as appropriate to foster the achievement of our goals.
There's been some discussion in recent days. It's gotten a lot of attention. The idea of selling bills or letting bills run off of your portfolio to address a collateral squeeze in money markets. Is that something you think needs to be considered at this time?
Again, as I said, I wouldn't want to speculate. Really, I'll just say we'll if conditions do change materially, we'll be prepared to use our tools in whatever way is appropriate at that time to foster the achievement of our goals.
I know a lot of this talk about inflation and interest rates can feel abstract. And so I wonder if you could put into plain language what the practical effect is of the changes the Fed has been making over the last year to your framework. What does it mean for everyday workers?
Great question. So I guess I have to say, for a long time, and when I was entering the job market years ago, when we had low employment, we had high inflation. So when the job market got good and tight, employers were, actively seeking people, and there were plenty of jobs, inflation would be moving up, and therefore the central bank, the Fed, would be raising interest rates to cool off the economy. And I would say 50 years ago that was appropriate because there was this tight connection between unemployment and inflation. More recently, though, that I think the Fed established its credibility several decades ago on inflation, and since that time, the connection between having a lot of people out of work and and inflation under control has gotten very, very weak. So our new framework very explicitly takes that we takes that in that new learning, that new understanding, and says that we won't raise the interest rates to cool down the economy just because unemployment gets lower, just because employment gets high. We're going to wait to see signs of actual inflation or the appearance of other risks that could threaten achievement of our goals. And we've seen that the economy can sustain very low levels of unemployment without inflation. So what does that mean for job seekers? It should mean that the job market will be stronger over time. We also saw the terrific social benefits of a very strong job market during 2018, 19, and the early part of 20. We saw workers at the low end of the wage scale getting the biggest increases. We saw labor force participation moving up. So people who might have given up on finding a job found a job, and people at the margins of society, maybe coming out of prison, things like that, got jobs. And there was really a lot to like about a very strong labor market. So we're really, really committed to getting back to a very strong labor market, and the strong anchoring of inflation expectations, the inflation dynamics that we have, give us the ability to do that. But it does require that we remain committed to keeping inflation expectations anchored at 2%, and we will do that.
Of course, some prominent economists in the last couple of weeks, as you know, Larry Summers, Olivier Blanchard, are saying that policymakers have maybe grown too quick to conclude from recent decades that low unemployment is no longer inflationary. Are they right to worry about this right now?
Well, so many people, particularly people who are now entering the job market, will not have lived through high inflation, and high inflation is a very bad state of affairs, and it hurts people the most on fixed incomes and lower incomes who have less wealth to draw upon. So inflation was very high when I was in college and coming into the job market. So it's really not something we want. But I would say, at the at the Fed, we are well aware of the history and how it happened, and not going to allow it to happen again. It was a situation where the Fed didn't step in when it should have, when inflation pressures were building. Not at all the current situation. Inflation is currently running below 2%. It's running at 1.5%. But we're very mindful of what happened in really the 1960s and 1970s, and determined not to repeat that mistake. But you have to differentiate, though, between one-time price effects, such as things that happen around the reopening of an economy, not something we have much experience with, and just the sort of, when I say base effects, it's a technical term. You look through that; it's not really signaling anything about inflation. So, I mean, we're very mindful, and I think it's a constructive thing for people to point out potential risks. It's always constructive. I always want to hear that. But I do think it's more likely that what happens in the next year or so is going to amount to um, prices moving up, but not staying up, and certainly not staying up to the point where they would move inflation expectations materially above 2%. That would take, and the public would have to come to believe that that's the new policy, that's the new reality, And I really don't think that, a couple of quarters of prices, or even more than that, but prices being above 2%, would change the psychology, particularly in a world where inflation has been the problem for the last decade in in all of the major advanced economy countries. They've been facing low inflation because of these global disinflationary pressures, which haven't gone away, and they're not going to go away overnight.
So it's been a year really since we began to face this pandemic, at least in the United States. You announced your first of two emergency rate cuts a year ago yesterday. And so as we mark that anniversary, what are one or two of the most important lessons you think we've learned from this economic crisis?
Yeah, we've been thinking about that a lot. You're right, we're sort of going into the anniversary of that extraordinary period. So the first thing is, and we really implemented something that we learned from in the last crisis, the global financial crisis, and that is that we needed to move quickly and powerfully with our tools and not hesitate. And we really did that this time. And so did Congress, by the way. The CARES Act passed within a month, really, of the pandemic starting to get going. We had very strong fiscal policy in the original CARES Act, unanimously passed by Congress, and we cut rates twice. We started asset purchases to support market function at an unprecedented level, and we also announced the opening and opened um, facilities to replace to assure the flow of credit to households, businesses, and municipalities in the country. All of those things were in place very quickly. So thing one is when you have a real crisis, attack quickly and don't hold back. Thing two is don't stop until the job is done. So there's a real sense that in the last crisis, um, really fiscal policy pulled back and became tight, and it led to a very long, slow recovery. So we're committed to using our tools and staying on the playing field with our tools until the job is really done. We're committed to that, and Congress, of course, has come with quite strong fiscal policy, and so I think we're in, if you look around, we're in the place we're in now. There's still a lot of pain out there, and more than 500,000 people have lost their lives to the pandemic. But compared to the economic scenarios that we were contemplating a year ago, this is, it's good to be where we are, and particularly with the vaccines now. No one thought we'd have vaccines within a year, less than a year. And now vaccination is moving at a good pace. We really are looking, if we can just decisively end the pandemic, we could get back to normal and avoid a lot of the longer term damage that we were concerned about happening. But we haven't done it yet. We haven't succeeded in this yet, but we're right there. I think if we can, the next couple of months will be very important on the pandemic. If we can keep making progress, that's what will help the economy more than anything.
And of course, last year you talked a lot about the need for fiscal policy, that is, government spending to engage. It came through at the end of the year with $900 billion. Now it looks like we may get something, a few shades less than $2 trillion. Is this going to be too much, too fast?
We we it's not our job. Our job as assigned by Congress is to use our tools to foster the achievement of maximum employment and price stability. We're not the Congressional Budget Office. We don't make assessments and we don't play a role. We're not up on Congress testifying on this or that fiscal policy. We're not in the discussions or the negotiations. It's just not our job. So I wouldn't comment on this particular fiscal policy. It's just not. It's just, we have this precious independence the Fed does from political interference in our decisions, and the other side of that is stick to your job, stick to your knitting, which we try to do.
Yes, we've heard that from you a few times before. Since we are here talking about jobs and careers, you said recently that you love your job and your term as chair is up in less than a year. Would you like to serve a second term if it was offered?
I have nothing for you on that today. My focus is on the current challenges that we face and doing my job. There's a lot left to do. We have a lot of ground left to cover, and good reason for optimism. I mean, the last maybe lesson would be, even in terrible times, try to take counsel from your hopes as well as your fears, because um, when in March and April of last year, I mean, but you saw the way the people responded, and the way the response, and then where we are. It's really, we should never sell ourselves short. And so I would just point out that it's good to be optimistic, but nothing new for you on that topic.
Well, on that note, we look forward to the day when we're able to have events like this in person again. But notwithstanding that, we're honored to have had you join us virtually today. So thank you, Chair Powell, for a great conversation.
Thank you, Nick.
And also, thanks to our audience following online at WSJ.com and on Twitter. Next up, we have the National Employment Law Project's Executive Director, Rebecca Dixon, and the U.S. Chief Economist from S&P Global, Beth Ann Bovino, to discuss the labor market, unemployment, and how to navigate the current crisis. Please welcome Rebecca, Beth Ann, and my colleague, Professional Products Editor, Kimberly Johnson.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome. I'm going to get right to it. I want to follow up on the chairman's remarks, and I want to start with.
So guys, if you like the live event, you can leave a like in the video, you can subscribe to my channel, and if anyone is interested, we will continue to see today's panel. And as I say, welcome to the channel. We can have here a conversation, and if you like the video and the channel, you can just give a like and subscribe, and we'll continue with the chat.
That brings it up to close to 15 million. So it means that we have a lot of work to do. And it also means that according to the Fed's new policy proposals, that they're not just looking at that unemployment rate, they're looking at a much more broad base. And I think that's a good thing. It also means that there's a lot of work to be done.
Right. And to that point, and I'm going to go to Rebecca here, we reported this morning that, people filing for unemployment benefits, a number have reached, one of its lowest rates in nearly 3 months today, even though the recovery is slow. And so, Rebecca, from an employment perspective, what do you make of that? And, particularly as we look at certain industries that are hard hit by the pandemic.
Kimberly, I think it's probably one of the issues we're seeing is folks are exhausting their benefits. So they've exhausted the eligibility that they had, given that the pandemic has gone on for so long. And we also know that there are challenges for workers to actually access the UI system. The crush of claims has made it really hard in some states for folks to even get through to make an application. So those are some of the factors that I think are contributing to this information.
Right. And so do you see that certain sectors are enjoying, a better recovery than others? Obviously, tourism and hospitality and service industry people are having a tougher time as things are slow, businesses are slow to reopen. Where are some of the bright spots in your opinion? Beth Ann?
For me. First, I wanted to note one thing when I mentioned that unemployment rate about 6.3%. And indeed, because as all the people who are out of the workforce, and also because of a lot of people are misclassifying, meaning they think they have work, but they're actually considered temporarily unemployed. It's much higher, but it's much better than where we were in April when the unemployment rate was close to 15%. So I did want to put that in perspective. As you mentioned, where are some of those jobs that are doing, those industries that are doing well? Well, think about what we're doing now. We're on a webinar. We're working with a lot of social media now. A lot of work is remote. So you're looking at financial industries are still doing rather well. To IT is doing very well as well. And also a lot of those good producing services. Housing is, if you want a V-shaped recovery, it's in housing. So that means the jobs are tight there, as well as a significant amount of, and even manufacturing is doing rather well. But as you pointed out, those customer-facing businesses are still incredibly challenged, like leisure and hospitality, where you're seeing an unemployment rate that is high in the double-digit numbers.
Right. I want to encourage people in the audience to send in questions, and we will answer them as we go along, and we'll leave some additional time at the end for questions. Um, talking Rebecca, talking about people that are just opting out of the job market. It's hard to access UI benefits. Do you believe that the stimulus will be a boon for people because maybe they've exhausted their unemployment benefits, or is it just a matter that people have to get back into the workforce in some way?
I think it's a both and. So we have a record number of folks that are facing basically a tsunami of challenges with housing and food security. And so this stimulus is very important to providing relief to those families. But we also know that women are concentrated in the lower end of the labor market. They make up a huge portion of the jobs that pay low wages, and those jobs also don't have flexibility. And we've seen a caregiving crisis along with this crisis where there is not access to childcare, and we have homeschooling given the pandemic. So all those things are contributing to putting downward pressure on folks actually being able to rejoin the labor market.
Right. And Beth Ann, what are you seeing from the work that you do at S&P from a more economic academic focus in terms of people that are just left out of the workforce at this point in time?
Well, I also wanted to add, in terms of those people who are left out of the workforce, I did want to kind of follow along with what Rebecca had said in terms of the stimulus. We do think that the 1.9 trillion will actually be a boost to the economy in terms of in terms of jobs created. Now, of course, it will help a lot of those people who are unemployed, as we talked about. But we also expect to see that stimulus, money in people's pocketbooks means more money to spend. That helps businesses. Businesses then need to hire more folks. That means, in our assessment, that means that by year end, the unemployment rate would drop to around 5%. That means that would mean about 1.6 million workers would be added to the workforce then without that stimulus. So that is a nice boost. In terms of, Kimberly, you were talking about labor participation rate. What are people doing? I wasn't sure exactly what you were getting at. Could you ask that again?
No, I wanted to find out, and this goes to some of the questions that we're hearing, in terms of, are there industries that are withstanding the pandemic well enough that people should seek to go into? We have a session coming up later today about reskilling and getting training for a new line of work. And so I wanted to kind of gauge your temperature on, where we see that going. Is that the avenue people should pursue?
Well, I do see an issue in terms of the question of reskilling. I do think many of these low-paying jobs, particularly in leisure and hospitality, many of them may not come back. When you think about where we stand, how many businesses that were in that area, how many survived, for one thing, and those that did survive, the capacity levels that they have, maybe it's going to be could likely be a lot smaller than what they had before the virus. And indeed, because there's been a move in terms of improving kind of hands-free transactions, they may not need that many workers. So in terms of the question of moving into another area, I suspect indeed that does require more skills, but I do see the movement in terms of moving into any kind of area that where you could see online, or you could see doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a PhD in computer science, but something where you see where you've developed your technological skills to be able to work in this new online environment. I think would be a huge success for those folks who are looking.
Right. Now, Rebecca, I know that your belief is that retraining and reskilling, or upskilling, whatever it's called, is not as easy as it potentially sounds. And I know that your organization has done some work around that.
Right. When we are talking about things like workforce training, those programs are designed to reach the ideal worker. So the person who's very well positioned to just take advantage of the opportunity, but they're often not designed for folks who have specific needs. And that brings in the impact on people of color. So when we're designing things for the ideal worker, that's going to be somebody who's probably making middle class earnings, who has access to high speed internet, who can do a job that requires that has an option for working from home. And we see that that's just disproportionately not the case for workers of color. So if we're creating an opportunity for training, we have to be measuring, we should have goals around that and not just be interested in getting someone in any job, but into a family sustaining job. And we need to make sure that those programs have wraparound services and other things that actually make it easy for folks to take advantage of the program, even if they're not right at the edge.
Right.
I would add one more thing to that, and I completely agree with what was said there. But another thing is that while we're having basically what had been an adjustment to a major change, a major innovation in the past, where it would take years to adjust. Now, technological change makes it days and even weeks, with even days, that things change, and so the skills adjustment might actually be obsolete just a few months later, and that's a real concern as well.
Right. And so a couple of questions from the audience around that. And there has been some general discussion from the federal government in creating a program like the Works Progress Administration, again, as we did in 1935. Is this still being reviewed as an option? Um,
Hmm.
or should it be viewed as an option, or is there a new model that we should explore?
I think you were talking about WPA, the workers program back in during the Great Depression. Is that right?
Correct. That was the question. Yes.
One thing that actually is being discussed and may be related now, wouldn't necessarily be tied to that. I'm sure they'll come up with a different name, but keep in mind that the Biden administration is talking about proposing some long-term policy initiatives that would include infrastructure. That would also infrastructure program, possibly climate change program. And there, when we think about infrastructure, for example, the jobs that are created in our analysis, we saw if 2 trillion was actually added to 2 trillion program was created that to last over 10 years, that would create about 2.4 million jobs by 2024. And those jobs would be in middle class jobs, construction, accounting, engineering, things that in a sense would be tied to, would maybe be in line with what this person had asked.
Right. And so there's some other questions where people are asking, how do they even get those skills? And then Rebecca, you just spoke about the fact that, sometimes when we talk about getting a job with a different set of skills, it is difficult. There's structural barriers that are in place. So what suggestions do you have for people in the audience that are truly interested in or trying to find out the best path forward?
I think that they could there are resources at their state and local unemployment insurance offices where they have resources to help folks try and match their skills with jobs that are available. And also there's counseling to help them actually sort of deconstruct what they're trying to do and match it to the local labor market where they're located. We often have answers like, oh, you should go into healthcare, you should go into these growing occupations, but it really is going to depend on where the person is located.
Right. And are there certain geographic areas in the country where certain industries there's more demand in certain industries?
I think we're going to see a shift